Dark screen, the faint crackle of fire. Slow zoom on an old man's face, lit by dying embers. In the heart of Warsaw, a veteran sits alone by the fire. Once he fought beside German soldiers in the Great War. Now he waits for those same Germans to burn his homeland to the ground. Outside his window, the sky flickers with distant flashes of artillery. He knows the war has already begun, long before the first shell falls. Music swells, drums echo faintly, archival images fade in. This is the story of Poland's desperate fight in 1939, of courage and betrayal of a nation crushed between giants, yet refusing to vanish from history. The invasion that sparked the Second World War told through the eyes of the Polish people. The crackling of the fireplace was the only sound that filled the dimly lit room. Outside, the city of Warsaw stirred uneasily, but inside, an old veteran sat motionless, his gaze locked on the dying embers. His face lined with age, and war seemed carved from stone, yet in his eyes lingered a storm of memory. He had seen empires rise and fall. Now he waited for his homeland's fate to be sealed once again. Every flicker of light through the threadbare curtains seemed to echo the distant flashes of artillery. He would have been out there standing shoulder to shoulder with the defenders of Poland if only his body still obeyed him. Once he had fought proudly alongside the soldiers of the German Empire during the Great War. The irony now was bitter. Those same Germans were marching to burn his country to ash. To this man, Poland's story was not a distant abstraction. It was etched into his bones. He had seen the nation torn apart, reborn from the ruins, and now teetering once more on the edge of destruction. Outside his door, history was about to repeat itself in the most brutal way possible. The fire sputtered, casting his room in shadow. For him, and for millions of Poles, the question was no longer if war would come. It was only a matter of when. Out of the ashes of the Great War, Poland had risen once more. After more than a century of partition and foreign rule, the Polish eagle spread its wings, fragile but proud. The new map of Europe gave Poland back its place, yet every border was contested, every neighbor a rival waiting for weakness. To the west stood Germany, humiliated by Versailles, but seething with vengeance, furious at the Polish corridor that cut East Prussia from the Reich. To the east loomed the Soviet Union, still nursing its wounds from the 1919-1920 Polish-Soviet War, where the Red Army had been halted at the gates of Warsaw. Neither giant had forgotten, neither forgave. In these perilous early years, Poland fought not only to survive, but to prove its right to exist. Every skirmish, every treaty was a reminder that independence had come at a terrible cost. Yet within its towns and fields, there was also hope, a belief that the suffering of generations had finally given way to sovereignty. But sovereignty in Eastern Europe was a fragile promise, and Poland's leaders knew that the dream could only endure if they secured allies strong enough to keep the predators at bay. Desperate to protect its new independence, Poland reached outward for allies. In 1921, it signed a defensive pact with France, an alliance meant to reassure the people that if the Soviets ever marched west again, they would not stand alone. Yet distance made the promise feel hollow. French soldiers were far away, and Polish soil could be consumed long before aid ever arrived. Still, the government persisted. In 1932, Foreign Minister Josef Beck secured a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. For a moment, it seemed the eastern border might be safe. 2 years later, another pact followed, this time with Germany. To ordinary Poles, it was a strange paradox. Peace treaties with both bitter enemies signed almost back to back. To the world, it looked like clever diplomacy. But beneath the surface, the foundation was fragile. Germany remained resentful, the Soviets patient and calculating. Poland was like a tightrope walker above a chasm, balancing between two predators whose appetites would not remain quiet forever. It was not a question of if one of the giants would strike, but which one would move first. By the late 1930s, the illusion of stability was shattering. Adolf Hitler, once dismissed as a loud but limited threat, had turned Germany into a resurgent war machine. The annexation of Austria in 1938, followed by the seizure of the Sudetenland, proved that his ambitions reached far beyond rhetoric. Europe watched uneasy as the Reich grew bolder with every move. For Poland, the danger soon became clear. Hitler's government delivered a list of demands: the annexation of the free city of Danzig, and the construction of a German-controlled highway and railway through the Polish corridor. On paper, it seemed like simple logistics. In reality, it would cut Poland off from the sea, strangle its independence, and give Berlin a ready-made excuse to seize the entire corridor later. Foreign Minister Beck stood firm. He understood that yielding even an inch meant surrendering sovereignty altogether. Danzig was not just a city, it was the symbol of Poland's fragile independence, a lifeline to the world. Losing it would mean living as Germany's vassal. His refusal was clear, defiant, and dangerous. With diplomacy collapsing, the Reich's gaze hardened on Warsaw. For Poland, the clock was ticking. The next chapter would not be written in treaties, but in blood. Inside Polish headquarters, generals wrestled with an impossible reality. They knew their country could not withstand Germany in a head-on clash. The answer became Plan West, a strategy to delay the enemy at the borders, then fall back behind Poland's great rivers, buying time until France and Britain struck Germany from the west. Survival depended not on victory in the field, but on endurance. On paper, it was a plan born of necessity. In truth, it was a gamble that placed Poland's future in the hands of allies who had already shown hesitation. Britain and France had pledged to stand with Warsaw, but their reassurances felt distant, their actions uncertain. Could they really be counted on to act swiftly, or would they watch from across their borders, safe behind the Maginot Line, while Poland bled? Some within the Polish staff voiced their doubts. General Wacław Stakiewicz warned that the country's limited resources and outdated equipment made even a delaying action risky. Others insisted faith in the West was Poland's only hope. Around the map tables, debates stretched late into the night, but one truth overshadowed them all: time was running out. The generals prepared for a fight they knew might be unwinnable, clinging to promises that would soon be tested in the fire of war. As summer 1939 drew to its close, Polish leaders pushed for a full mobilization. The signs of invasion were unmistakable: German troops massing on the border rail lines, alive with movement and propaganda flooding the airwaves. Yet Britain and France, fearful of provoking Hitler, urged caution. Their hesitation shackled Poland at the worst possible moment. When the order for general mobilization finally came on August 30th, it was already dangerously late. Soldiers scrambled to their post trains crowded with recruits and equipment, but precious days had been lost. While Warsaw hesitated, Berlin prepared its stage. On August 31st, German operatives in Polish uniforms attacked radio stations and border posts in a series of staged assaults. The world was told that Poland had struck first. By nightfall, Hitler's voice thundered across German radios denouncing these attacks and declaring that his Reich had no choice but to respond. The pretense was thin, but it didn't matter. The curtain had lifted. War was no longer a threat in the distance, it was a certainty waiting for dawn. On the eve of war, Poland's army stood at 500,000 strong, proud, disciplined, but starved of resources. 26 infantry divisions, 8 cavalry brigades, and a handful of armored units formed the backbone of the defense. Yet many soldiers marched on foot, their rifles decades old, their radios unreliable. Trucks and motorized transport were scarce. Horses carried the burden where machines could not. Still, Poland was not without strength. Its 7 TP light tank, armed with a 37mm gun, could tear through the flimsy German Panzer I and II. But only 161 of these machines existed. Far more common were the tiny TKS tankettes, little more than armored boxes with machine guns. Brave crews fought in them, knowing they were outmatched. The Polish cavalry, often mocked in German propaganda, remained among Europe's most flexible forces. These were not relics charging with lances into tanks, but mobile brigades armed with rifles, machine guns, and even anti-tank rifles. They could strike dismount and fight as infantry, a rapid response force in an army that lacked speed elsewhere. Across the border, the Germans held the advantage in sheer numbers and organization. But the myth of a fully mechanized blitzkrieg army was just that, a myth. German divisions also relied heavily on horses to pull their guns and supplies. The difference was not in technology alone, but in coordination speed and ruthless planning. For Poland, the imbalance was clear. Their soldiers would fight with courage, but courage alone could not close the gap. If the land forces were stretched thin, the situation in the skies was even more precarious. Poland's air force fielded fewer than 400 modern aircraft. Its pride, the PZL P-24 fighter, had been formidable when introduced in 1936, but by 1939, it was already outdated. Worse, many had been sold abroad, leaving Poland to rely on the older P-11's planes that seemed almost fragile compared to the sleek German Messerschmitts now waiting across the border. In the air, Polish pilots prepared themselves for near-certain sacrifice. They trained for daring maneuvers flying low and fast, knowing that their machines were slower, but their skill unmatched. They would not be able to command the skies, but they could make the Luftwaffe bleed for every victory. At sea, Poland's navy was a small but determined force. 5 submarines, 4 destroyers, and a collection of smaller vessels. Outnumbered and vulnerable, they faced the impossible choice of annihilation or survival. In a bold move, most of the destroyers slipped away to Britain just before the invasion, ensuring they would live to fight another day. The submarines remained mining the waters near Danzig and preparing to harass German shipping, a hidden dagger along Poland's coast. Against the vast might of Germany's Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe, these forces were like pebbles before a tidal wave. Yet for the Poles who served in them, their mission was simple: resist, disrupt, and prove that even a nation under siege could still strike back. At 4:45 in the morning, the silence was broken by thunder. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, a relic of the old Imperial Navy, opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte near Danzig. Shells exploded among the barracks. Sand and smoke erupted skyward, and the world's Second Great War had begun. Warrant Officer Władysław Baran remembered the chaos vividly. He spoke of sand and stone turned into shrapnel of tree branches, splintering in the blasts of human bodies, torn apart by the fury of steel. The ground shook as if Poland itself recoiled from the blow. Even as the echoes of the bombardment rolled across the Baltic, the German invasion swept forward on land. Armored columns pierced through border defenses engines, growling as tanks forced open gaps for infantry to flood through. The blitzkrieg had been unleashed, not yet perfected, but fast enough to overwhelm. By sunrise, Poland was already fighting for its life. And across the horizon, the dark smoke rising from Westerplatte was more than a battlefield, it was a warning to the world. Though German armor surged across the frontier, Polish resistance was anything but meek. The cavalry brigades, long mocked as anachronisms, proved their worth in fire and steel. At the Battle of Mokra, the Wawinska Cavalry Brigade fought with modern tactics, dismounting to fight as infantry rifles and anti-tank guns braced against the advancing panzers. By day's end, they had destroyed dozens of German tanks and inflicted hundreds of casualties. This was no desperate charge with lances against machines, as Nazi propaganda would later claim. These were seasoned fighters combining mobility with discipline. Their horses carried them swiftly into position, but their firepower came from modern weapons. In the forests and fields, their sudden strikes slowed the German advance more effectively than anyone had predicted. Elsewhere, Poland's armored trains roared to life. Massive steel beasts armed with cannons and machine guns, they raced along the country's vast rail network, striking supply lines and ambushing columns. To the Germans, they were relics of another era, yet in battle, they proved terrifyingly effective, engaging in nearly 90 skirmishes during the invasion. Each of these desperate defenses carried the same message: Poland would not collapse without a fight. The invader had expected a swift march to victory. Instead, they found defiance at every turn, and courage that turned even outdated weapons into tools of fear. On September 3rd, the news reached Warsaw, Britain, and France had declared war on Germany. Church bells rang, crowds cheered, and weary soldiers lifted their heads with renewed determination. At last, the promises of alliance seemed real. To many Poles, it felt like salvation, the belief that the Reich would now be forced to divide its armies and face a second front. For days, people clung to hope. Rumors spread that French divisions were already advancing into the Saar region, that British planes were in the air. Families huddled in basements whispered to one another that Poland's sacrifice was buying precious time, and that help was on its way. The nation, bleeding but unbroken, convinced itself that its allies would not abandon them. Yet on the front lines, officers read the situation with grim clarity. No French divisions crossed the Rhine in strength, no British fleets struck the German coast. The Western offensive existed mostly on paper, a token gesture rather than a hammer blow. For Polish commanders, a terrible question took root: would their allies fight, or had Poland been left to face annihilation alone? The cheers in the streets slowly faded. Behind the hopeful smiles, doubt began to gnaw. The war was only days old, yet already the shadow of betrayal stretched long over Poland. As German columns pressed deeper into Poland, all eyes turned to Warsaw. The capital had to hold. For weeks before the invasion, over 150,000 civilians had labored with soldiers digging anti-tank ditches, hauling sandbags, and stacking makeshift barricades of furniture and rubble. The city had become a fortress built by its own people. On September 8th, the horizon darkened with the silhouettes of German panzers. They rolled into the southern suburbs, steel monsters against brick and cobblestone. Yet the defenders stood their ground. When another attack came from the west, Polish troops fought from behind barricades, repelling the enemy and even destroying dozens of tanks. It was a shocking setback for the Germans, who had expected Warsaw to fall quickly. The defenders fought with ingenuity as much as with weapons. When anti-tank rifles were scarce, they poured turpentine across the streets and set it ablaze, turning avenues into walls of fire. From balconies, desperate civilians hurled flaming mattresses onto advancing vehicles. Every street became a trap, every building a bunker, every basement a shelter and command post. For nearly 3 weeks, Warsaw endured relentless air raids and bombardments. German bombs fell in waves, 17 raids in a single day, reducing entire districts to ash. But the capital refused to surrender. In its defiance, Warsaw was no longer just a city under siege, it was the heart of a nation's will to survive. While Warsaw burned, desperate pleas poured from Polish diplomats to London and Paris. The French had indeed moved into the Saar on September 7th, capturing villages and facing only token German resistance. At first, it seemed like the breakthrough Poland had prayed for proof that their allies were striking west as promised. But then, without warning, the French advance halted. Their divisions dug shallow trenches and waited, staring across a quiet front. Within days, they began to withdraw, retreating to the safety of the Maginot Line. The British, too, limited themselves to declarations and cautious preparations, their armies far from the battlefield. For the Poles, the news was devastating. They had staked their survival on Plan West, on the faith that their allies would attack Germany and force a two-front war. Instead, they watched that faith crumble. The Saar offensive, once whispered about with hope in Warsaw's streets, became a symbol of betrayal. In the trenches and command posts of Poland, officers understood the truth: no help was coming. Whatever promises had been made in distant capitals, the Polish soldier now stood alone against the Reich. And yet, despite the bitterness of abandonment, they fought on because surrender was unthinkable. On September 17th, as German forces closed their grip from the west, a new shadow fell across Poland's eastern frontier. The Red Army poured over the border tanks and infantry, rolling in under the terms of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. For many Poles under siege, the first reports sparked a fragile hope. Perhaps the Soviets had come to resist the Germans. But that illusion shattered almost instantly. In cities like Lwów, citizens prepared to welcome what they thought were allies. Instead, they discovered a second invader. The Soviets were not there to rescue Poland, but to claim their half of the spoils. What had once been a war for survival against one giant had become a suffocating Vice-German steel on one side and Soviet armor on the other. The Polish High Command, realizing resistance was doomed, fled toward Romania, leaving their soldiers and people behind. For the ordinary units still fighting, confusion turned to despair. Some continued their battles against the Germans. Others resisted the Soviets, but everywhere the same bitter truth set in Poland had been betrayed not once, but twice. It was the knife in the back, delivered just as the defenders of Warsaw were still clinging to the ruins, still daring to believe that survival might be possible. By late September, Warsaw lay in ruins. After weeks of bombardment and siege, the city's garrison surrendered on the 27th, its defenders broken not by lack of courage, but by exhaustion and the sheer weight of fire raining down. One soldier recalled the silence that followed the order. No cries, no questions, only the hollow understanding that their struggle had reached its end. Yet Poland did not vanish in defeat. Nearly 100,000 soldiers escaped through Romania and Hungary, carrying with them the determination to fight again. They would reappear in France and Britain in North Africa, and above the skies of England, where Polish pilots etched their names into legend during the Battle of Britain. The underground resistance too began to take shape, sowing the seeds of defiance that would one day erupt in the Warsaw Uprising. The cost had been immense: cities, burned villages, destroyed, hundreds of thousands dead or captured. Poland had been torn apart by the pact of two dictators crushed between steel and ideology. And yet, even as their land was divided, their spirit endured. The invasion of 1939 was not just the fall of a nation, it was the opening act of a world consumed by war. Poland's story, written in blood and defiance, asked a haunting question that still lingers today: when allies hesitate and enemies conspire, what becomes of the small nations caught in the storm?